Hi everyone, welcome to the global finals of BTITF OIC 2021 global phase. I am Ahmad Jami. I'm a part of the CAP and I will be the chair for the global phase. My panels are here as well, who will be introducing themselves in a second. Oh wow, just a second. So a couple of quick rule of thumbs before we proceed. Number one, it would be helpful if the speakers at the start of their speech mentions their preferred gender pronoun plus their preferred method of taking POIs. I think that would be really helpful for everyone. Secondly, I think unless or until mentioned specifically to raise POIs through voice chat, you can always do that through text chat. Thirdly, please time yourselves as well. It would be really helpful if one of the ORCOM members could keep timers in the text chat. But yeah, I think that's quickly all about that. I would now like to invite my panelists to unmute themselves and introduce themselves one by one. Rosy, would you like to start?
Sure, Rosy is there.
Thank you. Labib.
Hi, I'm Labib. My preferred gender pronouns are he or him.
Fantastic. Macharia.
Hi everyone, Macharia, he, him.
Fantastic. Jonathan.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan, he, him, and best of luck to the finals.
Lovely, thank you so much. Can we hear from OG now? This will also work as a mic test, so yeah.
Hi, Taha going first. He, they pronouns preferred.
Hamza second, no preference. Thank you.
Got it. DPM.
Yeah, so DPM was Hamza. He said no preferences.
Great. Opening opposition.
Sorry, Enshia going first. She, her, please.
Great.
I use they, them pronouns.
All right. Thank you so much. Closing out.
Hi, Aliya going first. I prefer she, they.
Lovely. Govit.
Hello, Nayara going second. She, her, they, them are fine.
Amazing. Closing up.
Hi, this is Neel. I'll be going first. Shuvam will be going whip, and pronouns are he, him.
Amazing. My preferred pronouns are here. With all of that being said, I think we can start with the round. The motion for this round reads, this house believes that feminist movements in the West should refrain from getting involved in the fight for empowerment in developing nations. With that being said, Prime Minister, you have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Great. I just want to check before I start if I am audible and visible.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are indeed. Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two clarifications before I go into argumentation for this case. I think the first thing to note over here is what do we mean by involvement? Now, we're not saying that you shouldn't donate to local organizations that seek to help women, or donate to organizations like UNICEF. Like, as a global citizen who is sympathetic to humanitarian causes, we presume that you can anonymously or give small donations to these sorts of charities or organizations. What do we not stand for? What is the kind of stuff we don't support? We don't want discursive involvement of the Western feminist movement over here. We don't want any sort of alliances in terms of organizational strategizing or active logistical support where you go out and go for a BBC photo op and an interview and say, this is what's happening in that country and this is how we're helping them and this is what they should do, or even just telling them what they should do and what the ideal strategies are. We don't want that kind of involvement with these organizations. We just want you to stay away. Two arguments coming from us, but before that, just one simple thing. We accept that Western feminist organizations to a certain degree have an obligation to help these people, but the problem over here is that they don't have the capacity to. What are the two reasons for why we think that is so? Firstly, I'm going to explain to you why this is going to be bad for feminist movements in developing countries. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why this is bad for feminist movements in the West. Let's look at why this is bad for feminist movements in developing countries. The first thing to note over here is that these movements are at the point at which you do photo ops with these people or so on, are going to be branded as anti-Western necessarily. Now, the comparative over here isn't that they're not going to be branded, Western stooges on our side. Of course they are, but it's a difference in scale, right? It's a very visible difference where a feminist from another country comes up and says, this is the feminist I'm talking to, and this is her experience, or these are the experiences of women there, and does it like a photo op. So it's a very clear target that you're giving them. Okay. Why is this a crucial argument? I want to note that within developed countries kind of did some bad things. Firstly, there's the fact of colonialism, which means that people really don't like the West. They don't like Britain, they don't like America, so on and so forth. But second thing I want to note is that oftentimes Western feminist movements, or like in the vast majority of cases, establish themselves on a secular politics, which does not coincide with the religious politics that oftentimes feminists or other people within these countries ascribe to. The last thing I want to note is Western countries still do lots of other stuff. It's not just historical colonialism. They go to war in Afghanistan, they intervene in Pakistan, so on and so forth, give funding to military dictatorships and so on. Now, why is this a problem? I think the first thing to note over here is at the point at which you're branded as a Western stooge, this reduces buy-in from the population. This reduces buy-in from men, sure, but it crucially also reduces buy-in from women who've been hurt by the same things or ascribe to similar values. The second thing I want to note is this crucially changes incentives of other actors as well. So for instance, if you were a government that was willing to do some local reform on a local level, which wouldn't get lots of attention, now this is going to get attention. And now you as a government are also going to be branded as a Western stooge. No government in developing countries would want to do this, especially if you look at South Asia, where you see Pakistan or even African countries where they don't want to seem like Western stooges. This is bad for them electorally. What is the crucial thing over here then? It reduces the ability for you to get local reforms in, but it also reduces the capacity for you to get more protesters in, more donations in from local organizations, or also more people willing to join the feminist movement and enhance its discourses. This is a key argument in this round. The second thing I want to note is with regards to elite co-option that happens necessarily. I want to note that when Western feminists come in, they use their education and their language to talk about these issues and display them and frame them in a certain way. The problem here is then they set priorities for these movements because they have more power. I want to note they get more media attention, they are more respected within society, and for all these sorts of reasons where they have more capital, more resources, they are able to come and get more spotlight. What is the problem with setting priorities? But also, by the way, I just want to note that there's a bit of arrogance that we have achieved so much and therefore we know what the better strategies are. I want to note that feminists within developing countries are different in the sense that they oftentimes have cultural alliances, religious alliances, where they don't agree with issues with these feminist movements. So for instance, it is perfectly fine for you to meet a feminist within Bangladesh or Pakistan who are not pro-abortion rights, want like an Islamic interpretation, believe in family values, so on. What's the problem with elite co-option? We just think that this leads to issue erasure, where you focus on different things as opposed to things that matter. Again, this goes back into reducing buy-in for protests or funding for local organizations. But secondly, I just want to note that even if OP comes up and says, oh, these movements are going to act rationally and they're not going to do much stuff, I want to note that there's information asymmetry, which means that this is necessarily the case regardless of whether your intentions are pure. The first thing is, you as a Western feminist don't have the lived experiences of women on the ground in these developing countries. The second thing is you have propositional knowledge, right? So you know about the issues because you watch the BBC, but the BBC is not a local news organization which is representing the views of local people. It's just an organization that's giving you a Western sort of like understanding of what's happening there. And the last thing I want to note is that your sources of contact, even within feminist movements in developing countries, are likely to be the most elite feminists who happen to come to Oxford or Cambridge for their degrees and did like a gender studies masters or whatever. So if that's the most likely point of contact for you, they are also not representative of these women. Again, this goes back to the impacts that I said. The third thing I want to note is that you cause splintering within the local movement as well. Because note, religious conservative feminists don't want to ally themselves with a movement that is secular and doesn't represent their values, but also radicals within the movement also blame Western feminists for lots of stuff like colonialism and so on, or the general power hierarchy, which erases their voices. Before I move on, I'm going to very quickly take CO. Nothing from CEO. I'm going to move on then. Okay, so in terms of splintering, why is this a problem? Because it's already a weak movement and you're going to make it weaker necessarily as a result. The last thing I want to note is you also make it difficult for these movements to call out Western movements at the point at which you're giving them active support, because the incentives for them are, we must keep them on board and therefore we must not criticize them. This is a huge problem because this means that feminist discourses don't get intersectionalized to the degree that we would like them to be. And this is important for representation and representing women throughout. The second argument then is, why is this bad for feminist movements in the West? Something that Hamza will talk about further. But the first thing I want to note over here is with regards to minority women. Minority women within the West are screwed over by Western women, especially white women, and women who generally lead the feminist movement within the West. They are the people who you owe very strong obligations to. There are two ways in which you screw them over. Firstly, there's a discursive thing of saying, we're great. We're helping minority women who are much more screwed over than you, and therefore we're doing our job. But two, your struggles aren't as important as the struggles of those women in Pakistan or Afghanistan because they're facing worse off issues. The problem over here then is you are unwilling to give the spotlight to these women, focus on their issues and try solving their problems. Hamza will extend this further, but for all these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thanks to Prime Minister for that fine speech. The Republican will now have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are indeed.
All right. Just give me 1 second. I prefer POIs by chat, but if I am not taking one, feel free to unmute yourself before 6. Panel, we live in a globalized world where the interconnected nature of global feminism often means that organizers on the ground in developing nations are the ones who are directly taking to social media and getting access to different kinds of resources and requesting help from Western feminist movements themselves. They're requesting for things like aid, they're requesting for things like greater media scrutiny for publicizing the issues that people are facing to a globalized audience. On opening opposition, we think it is principally wrong for any movement to refuse their cries for help for the sake of artificially preserving purity or indigeneity of these movements. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. First, just some framing and rebuttal to what we heard coming out of opening opposition before forwarding two crucial arguments. First, a principle on how the feminist movement is, on principle, a movement of solidarity, and why people in the developing world have skin in the game, why people in the developed world have skin in the game in these different kinds of movements. And secondly, why this is just going to be really freaking helpful for achieving a lot of the aims of feminist movements on the ground. So I think the framing in this debate is that feminist movements in the West are just simply not stupid. And they are more often than not responding to calls for help within the developing world itself. That is to say, they establish very solid chains and streams of donations and support once these movements express some need for it, for instance, funding for education or other things like funding for period products. Now, I want to respond to some things we heard extraneously. On the idea that we're going to splinter the movement, right? That religious conservative women are going to be even more disinclined toward working with women in these countries who are more secularly based. I think that if the religious conservative faction of these movements exist, they're not going to want to partner with the secular parts of the movement in these countries to begin with, because if one faction of the feminist movement is able to accept things like abortion and another faction supports like extreme religious dogma, then they're probably already not concerned about the same things to begin with and are already splintered in the status quo. The second thing I want to respond to extraneously is the idea of the feminist movement being really controversial and under attack by conservatives, that somehow having the association with Western feminism is going to elicit conservative backlash. We think that conservative backlash will exist on either side of the house, given the fact that these conservatives have incentives to just smear the feminist movement no matter what. If they're not involved and not getting support from Western feminists, they'll find some other reason to make these things extremely controversial. So then the question in this debate exists, given that this controversy will exist, which side can better get resources to help people who need it the most? Now, two main arguments, and then some other rebuttal will be integrated. One, the feminist movement and the solidarity of oppressed women is global in nature. Fragmenting it is principally wrong and it hurts women. The first thing I want to say under this is that women and gender minorities are oppressed everywhere by the same patriarchal structures. This fact is very important because spreading of this knowledge creates a sense of solidarity across the world. It empowers and makes the feminist movement inherently stronger because things that start in Western movements can now spread more easily to developing countries too. It also creates a sense of hope to know that other movements have walked a path you could eventually walk to empower your own population. And this is really, really good in terms of sending a signaling to your own people that this movement is viable, that there is a model somewhere that you can definitely achieve these things, even though it might be on a later time scale. The second thing to say is that there already exist very tangible links between diaspora populations and indigenous movements in the developing world. Because in the age of globalization, many women and gender minorities born in developing nations or their next generation are the ones who are living in countries like Canada, are the ones who are living in countries like Britain and America. And they're directly affected, and their experiences of oppression are shaped by the patriarchal structures that the parents have absorbed and continue to perpetuate upon them. They see people who look like them and who are maybe their next of kin experiencing these things in their home countries. And that is why the framing and the weighing for this argument then becomes, these people want to fight and should be able to. They have experienced firsthand the oppression that their parents have felt, and that just because they're continuously hurt by the oppression in the developing world, they have skin in the game, and that their right for advocacy and self-expression adheres in this instance. And it is wrong for government to take a stance to say they cannot organize on their parents' behalf, or they cannot organize on the behalf of the things that they have experienced firsthand. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from CG if you have one.
Right. The feminist movement is literally already splintered, pro-life, pro-choice, etc. Why is your principle more important than the fact that aligning with the West literally hurts the most vulnerable women in these developing countries?
I think the analysis at the top still applies here, right? Which is to say, if there are conservative factions within these countries who want to target feminist movements, they're always going to do so either way, regardless of whether or not you have a Western brand attached to it. They hate the feminist movement so much, they will always do this. But more importantly, I think the principle of self-expression and advocacy is not something that this POI addresses. Next, I want to talk about why this is really, really freaking helpful. Why will this, at the first, like the high level, be executed incredibly well? One, feminist movements in the West are already intersectional in nature. The third wave of feminism had to include gender minorities and racial minorities because of the fact that the Western nations themselves were getting actively more diverse within the past few decades. They had to include women that are now becoming a really sensible part of their populations inside the new forms of advocacy. They're secondly also acutely aware of not having dominant structures because it is antithetical to the very ideals of feminism they espouse, which is equality. They have had previous experiences being mansplained, and they actively do not want to recreate these structures of oppression. It does not mean that we are perfect, but this analysis does mean that there are channels to critique problematic individuals, and it makes the idea of the whitewashing that OG talks about very, very marginal, because even if the whitewashing exists, there are a lot of corrective mechanisms within these movements to make sure it does not overtake the entire movement. What then, given this framing, are the direct, tangible benefits that we're able to elicit on our side of the house? One, I think it looks like direct aid, right? And the framing for this section of the analysis is quite intuitive because where's the money? It is in the developed world. It is in where the vast amount of global capital rests in the entire world. The involvement of the feminist movement from Western nations has, one, made it a goal for these feminist movements to donate quite actively, right? So even though they frame it out as, oh, we can still have anonymous donations, the scale here is simply not the same as having the entire feminist movement say this is something you should aspire toward, that you should be putting a lot of money toward doing, like, education development in rural areas in India, for instance. Secondly, it gives issues in the developing world massive publicity and makes it something that people know about and is able to advocate for on a wider scale throughout the entire world. And lastly, it develops these channels of support to redirect resources, for instance, tangible goods like period products, funding for schools, and educational programs for birth control. All of these things get massively more funding once you allow individuals within the West to be able to donate. And note, these are pretty politically uncontroversial. Like every feminist everywhere can agree that these things are really, really important. The second thing is you oftentimes reach a critical political mass, right? Because Western backlash now happens when there are really oppressive incidents, for instance, acid attacks in the developing world, that makes it so that, because of the fact that these nations, their populations have a lot of purchasing power, they're able to pressure their own governments to have a stance against these atrocities, which makes it so that people within the developing nations are emboldened to have a stance against these kinds of atrocious incidents. It makes it more okay to normalize discourse against these things, and makes it so that people in the developing world feel women in the developing world feel a lot less alone when they have active voice support from these global movements, and they feel as though they're part of something much, much bigger. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. DPM, you now have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can indeed. Loud and clear.
Before I start, I will probably take closing opposition at 5:30, so just keep that in mind. What is our counterfactual? One, using domestic cultural cleavages to push for progressive reform. This looks like feminists in Pakistan using progressive versions of the Quranic ayats to make sure that you get wage equality. This looks like Afro-Brazilian women, for instance, using Catholic liberation theology to push for progressive reform. This will be important later. Two, localized reform. We don't have to get reform across Brazil. Even if we get it in Rio de Janeiro, that helps 5 million women. Even if Pinjra Toad in India gets reform for women within Delhi, that's 6 million women who are helped out. But three, we do have cooperation between the global south. Brazilian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi feminists can work together with each other to mobilize these movements. That's what I've been trying to get done for the last 5 years. Two claims from our side. One, the things they haven't rebutted yet. Firstly, the intuition that these feminists don't have enough information about what's happening in the developing world. No response. Two, they have bad information. No response. Three, the only response that we got to the Western buy-in stuff was a straw man of conservative backlash will already exist. If you're going to give me the argument that it's a conservative argument to be anti-American and anti-Britain, then you're completely out of fact. I don't think there's a single person here who's sitting in this room from the global south who thinks that being anti-American, being anxious about Britain after a history of colonialism is a conservative argument. The vast majority of these countries are anti-West. And this has nothing to do with how they vote. This has to do with their historic relationship with the West, which means that you have zero buy-in on our side, on their side. Secondly, on the comparative, what we do is that, yes, sometimes we still use Western discourses. I'm happy to admit that, but there's a difference between using a discourse which emanated from a Western university and protesting with women who are white. The aesthetics of that completely compromises your movement. Second point that we made was about elite co-option. Also no response. This is where we said that priorities shift depending on what these elite feminists say. When white women who've been educated at Harvard and Yale go to UN women conferences leading these caucuses, they decide what reforms are passed, what is talked about in the BBC. The relevance of this then is that you get no media attention on their side because the media attention you get is the white woman talking about Pakistan. We don't want 100 articles about that. We'd rather get 2 articles where it's the Pakistani woman talking about Pakistani feminism. But number two, even in their best case, they get the most elite women within Pakistan talking to elite American feminists because they speak the same language. They went to the same liberal arts college 10 years ago. We want indigenous grassroots movement to stand up, all of that stuff. The final thing that I'll say here, which I think is really important, is about the splintering. You know, splintering happens on either side for these local movements. Why? Why does it happen? Presumably, if you have anti-abortion and pro-choice activists, they can find somewhere in the middle, for instance, rape exceptions. But the point at which the discourse becomes toxic is the point at which you are allied with the West. You don't think this because of religious justifications, cultural justifications. You think that because you support white feminists. That's what leads to splintering and the toxic discourse. Intersecting this with their principle. One, I feel like they made their principle in case prep because it's not responsive to our case. We completely agree that the feminist movement in the West is obligated to feminists in the developing world. We just think they make it much worse by being actively involved. So that's like 4 minutes of the yellow speech that I don't particularly care about. Let's further focus on their spotlight argument in the media. One, I want to point out, why does it matter if you get articles in the BBC if you don't get any outcomes on our side for the reasons I've given about Western demonization, all of that stuff? Two, we get some good coverage on our side, which is better than a lot of bad coverage on their side. Three, bad coverage might make things worse. When white feminists come in, they want to talk about trans bathroom inclusion, which is important considering that the West has reached a stage where they can talk about that. But we're not talking about the suffragettes here, but I would love for Pakistani feminists to coordinate it. Women in Pakistan can't vote. Women in Pakistan face horrible gender-based violence. But the point at which all of those articles are about such upstream issues that Pakistan needs a decade of progress to even think about is the point at which you get bad coverage on their side. But four, prioritize local news. How many people in Pakistan or Brazil or Bangladesh read the BBC every day? Focus on getting indigenous news outlets on your side to get more buy-in. The final claim that is standing from their side is the intuition about Western government pressure. One, how many times has Western government pressure to guarantee women's rights ever worked in any country? In fact, these dictatorships and governments double down the point at which they say these Western governments are trying to take away our culture. The reason that MB has liberalized reforms for women in the last 4 years is because of the work of Saudi feminist activists for the last 30 years. So don't you dare erase their progress and their efforts towards getting there and say that that was the best responsibility. The second thing I want to do in this speech, now that I've shown you that it's significantly better for developing world feminists to use domestic cleavages, coordinate with each other, and get localized reform, is show you why this is bad for Western feminists. One, it gives the impression that it's all good back home. No, it's not. Systemic patriarchy exists in countries across the world. Regimes of gender violence, human trafficking in the worst case, and domestic abuse is something like half of all women in every country in the West. You don't dare give that impression that everything is okay, the point at which you start focusing on women elsewhere. Two, I want to point out is a massive minority erasure within these movements, because how many Black feminists get to participate in the Women's March on Washington while they're waving those stupid Free Palestine signs? No one, right? Because they get to get away with that and abdicate their responsibilities to Black women, Asian women in America, the diaspora that opening opposition was talking about, by saying at least we're helping people elsewhere, even though, and this is extremely important, Western patriarchy is most directly responsible for the oppression of women of color within the West, within the West. Within that context and focusing on those women, intersectionalizing that discourse, making that movement more inclusive should be the order of the day for these Western feminists. Before I move on, I'm going to take CEO. Go ahead.
How do you ever get strategy, resources, and outreach on your side to create indigenous grassroots movements?
I mean, they exist. I just think this is an incredibly patronizing argument. In your own country, you have Pinjarah.org, you have the National Students Indian Alliance. Like, I can talk about 5 friends of mine who are doing this in India. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, these indigenous movements exist. The problem is that they don't get coverage because people like you come in and say that we have to work with Western feminists, get on the BBC, get on the CNN, respect their work, give it credence, and they'll get there. On funding then, 2 points here. Firstly, their funding point completely contradicts their accountability point, because they're like, you know, if there's whitewashing, we can deal with it later. Really? So they're getting a bunch of money from the West, and then they can also critique them for it. Of course they can't, because the funding that you want creates a relationship of dependence, which means that you can never counter that whitewashing in the first place, inherently contradictory there. But number 2, as I said to you, global concerned citizens exist. I can still donate to BRAC, I can still donate to the Grameen Bank, I can still donate to UNICEF, War Child, charities working on this. Like, feminists can still do that, they're just not actively engaged, which is literally what the motion says. But thirdly, even if they get more funding on their side towards what priorities, as I said, these priorities aren't localized and not culturally rooted. So even if they get some change, it's the change that's least relevant for these people. Panel, this is a horrible idea. We need to platform some fantastic feminist heroes within the developing world. Do not take away the spotlight from them. For that reason, I'm very, very proud.
Thanks to DPM for that fine speech. DLO, you now have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Please PO only by turning on your videos. I'll take CG.
Right.
Oh, Nayara and Aliya, if you can't turn on your videos, feel free to just unmute yourself and say POI as well, ideally closer to the 5th minute. I'm going to start by talking about the change in this debate. I think it's pretty obvious that local advocacy is good, that Afro-Brazilian women should be at the forefront of the movement in their respective countries, and that I would puke blood if someone from America decided to come in and explain feminism in China to me. The thing is though, this debate is not about whether or not one is preferable to another. This debate is whether or not we think that Western feminists should extend aid to people in developing countries in the first place. And I think the answer is roundingly yes. The reason for this is because, yes, there are really, really big reasons why local feminists have comparative advantage in many ways, in information, in connection, in wisdom, but foreign feminists also have a comparative advantage in things such as how much money they have, how much power they have with their own governments, and given the globalized nature of the world, I think that's super, super important that this option is open for them. So 3 clashes in the round. First on aid, second on choice, and third on what's important in terms of the principle. So first on aid, I think Enshia tells you a whole bunch of stuff about why there's a huge amount of tangible change that comes when you have Western feminists involved. You get direct action, i.e. the donation of millions and millions of pads and tampons to women in the developing world who cannot access them as cheaply as you can in Europe or East Asia. But second of all, you also get collective action in the critical mass. For example, the way the Me Too movement spread to China and helped us, even though it was mainstreamly spearheaded by Western feminists. And 3, just really, really uniquely, I want to say that OO and CO are absolutely right to say that the Western is is constantly fucking over developing countries. The thing then is that it's important for Western feminists to be cognizant of that and do their best to hold it in check. For example, campaigning against human trafficking, which is often from developing countries to developed countries and requires action from the richer country in order to prevent it as well. Two responses from OG. First, the idea that global concerned citizens can still do all of these things. Two responses. The first is this is a really soft stance that I think undercuts all of their analysis on how it's bad to independence. But second one, more importantly, yes, you have some donation on your side. We have substantially more. The reason for this is for a few reasons. The first is awareness and visibility, i.e., even if you could in theory donate, if this isn't on the BBC as they deride so much, we literally don't know that gender-based violence is happening in India, happening in China, happening in Hong Kong. And therefore it's impossible for many people who have the money to donate in the first place. But second of all, just economies of scale, making things mainstream, having really, really easy GoFundMe platforms online for Give Asia, for example, which allows this global interconnectedness to happen. I think we get millions and millions, if not billions of dollars more in assistance. But the second main thing I would say is I really, really do think that the thing about Western abuse is super freaking important. Western abuse is off because the important thing to note is that there is a difference between Western governments, which are very, very bad, no good at all, and Western feminist movements. That's because Western feminist movements and Western women are often the victims of governance, underrepresented in politics, and angry and resentful for the intersectional nature of the oppression that has been conducted by white men to women of color, women of all shapes and sizes. I think for those reasons, I do agree that there are huge swells up of anger, and I think that means the nature of the aid given is likely to be extremely good. Okay, second main thing then, on choice. So I wanted to say that the OG case, very, very pretty. The case boils down to feminists, Western white feminists especially, can be bad. They can be elitist and twist discourse. They can trigger anti-Western sentiment in these countries. They can have bad information and do stupid things. The first thing is I think a lot of this is asserted and not true. The reason for this is because we want to be very, very nuanced about what Western countries are like, because I think that the separation between the Western governments and Western feminist movements means I think lots of people are very, very sympathetic towards feminist movements in the West. That's why there was such a huge sense of solidarity in the Me Too movement. But the second main thing is, I agree in some cases, it is just objectively true that there are really, really bad eggs. The thing is though, that given that, the most important thing is to allow these developing countries to choose which forms of aid they would like to accept. Because I think the reason for this is because I think that they are the best place to do so. They have the best information. They have what they need. And I think that all of this is important because that good information and that nuance means they can selectively choose it. If I think that all of my supporters are going to riot because they think that this white lady from Oxford is pretentious and annoying and stuck up, I will choose not to platform her on my news network. On the other hand, if I think that it's worth fighting that small amount of backlash in order to get $1,000 in funding, which I could use to set up a shelter for women, then I should also do that. I'll take you in the next 30 seconds. I'll take the POI first and then explain why these movements have the capacity to make these choices well.
A lot of these white privileged women are actively shielded from any repercussions of things that they say on the media. The effect directly goes into grassroots movement who are trying to make some change because they're branded as imperialist. So exactly what is the change then under your world?
I think the first thing is that's really important, panel, is that all the problems that GovBench outlines are self-solving. That is, if they're pretentious, if they speak in English, if they're disconnected from local issues, if they're openly abusive, that means that people want to broadcast them less, that people get pissed off when they see them on the news, and feminists in the developing world can criticize them and say they don't represent us, or just other feminists from developed countries go, shut the fuck up, you don't know what you're doing, which means that the extent to which they affect the developing world is much, much smaller. Two more responses. The first is their entire line for why these Western feminists will dominate is because they have more money than you. Yeah, but they also have they're not exactly dedicated all of their wealth to the developing world. And the intuitive reason that this percentage exists is because people have a stronger attachment to the people around you, just because that's what you're surrounded and bathed in every single day, but also because empathy is stronger for people you see directly and connect with. The reason why this matters is because I think that people generally understand that they know less than people having a lived experience, because it's a very common thing common sense thing to realize. But the second thing is I also think is why we beat the OG extension about Black women. That is, I don't think that American women in the status quo say Black feminism doesn't matter because people in Nigeria have it worse, very simply because they see that suffering happening on a day-to-day basis. But finally, a lot of things really do require consent, i.e. if a Western feminist swans in and decides to start talking things, they can't implement things without the cooperation of local grassroots movement, because there's often a language disconnect, because they often don't have the connections necessary, which means local movements have an extremely high degree of choice, which means they access the huge wellspring of funding and political power that Western feminists have. They apply it to good use. I think we accelerate the pace at which we distribute menstrual products, sexual protection, and also just legal benefits and protections for people in the developing world. The feminist movement is a united one. Women across the world are oppressed by the same structures, never been prouder to oppose.
Thanks to DLO for that fine speech. With that, we conclude the debate in the upper half. Now, this is in the closing half. Member of Parliament, you have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are indeed.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay, so if anyone wants to ask a POI, you can just ask in the chat. I'll probably take it after 5. Panel, what most women want in the developing world is that they want value systems to change and they want structural reforms to change value mindsets, etc. I think therefore it probably means that it's more important for us to attach more palatable figures or individuals that these people can relate to in terms of role models, etc. Because it probably means that it does not skew your initial perception of what feminism ought to be. I'm going to first explain to you what exactly and how progress is often compromised under ops world. But second, I'm going to explain to you why exactly it's probably very risky for them to do so. Before that, just a few extraneous pieces of rebuttal to all. I think one, under principle of self-expression, I think that a lot of it is contingent upon them providing effective platforms for the most vulnerable women. OJ already talks about a lot of stuff about Western demonization and buy-in, etc. We're going to exactly paint you the picture of the journey and why specifically people on the ground exactly don't have value systems that change from the get-go just because of the fact that it is Western and how Western-centric and how exactly campaigning differs because the West is very antithetical in nature. Firstly, I think that the principle of self-expression often ignores the fact that even solidarity relies upon opposing or a large splintering of the feminist movement in and of themselves. So for example, it means that under their world, women essentially who are on the minority, who is more opposed towards what Western feminism stands for, cannot essentially be opposed to what their narrative is to begin with. I think it probably means that white women who already have a lot of political capital, economic capital, do not listen to these individuals because they already have established brands of feminism within their own countries and they already have a lot of liberties, etc. Don't actually have an incentive to listen to these individuals. So solidarity actually comes at the compromise of actually allowing a lot of vulnerable women to express themselves, because not only do you create a cycle of dependency, but I think it's more so because of the fact that these individuals don't actually have a huge amount of backlash, as was raised in our POI. But the second thing is that because these white women are not proximate to the amount of struggles that brown women face on a daily basis, they can necessarily just only advocate for people who are palatable in nature. CG says that backlash will be very high, that will incentivize them to kind of create structures and have individuals who are much more important in nature, which means that you're probably going to have people who are much more aligned with local values. I don't think that's the case. One is that I think most people in the West actually have antithetical narratives and incentives to begin with. This is because, for example, because they have a different mindset of what feminism ought to be. For example, the fact that they don't essentially think that skin issues pertaining to skincare, skin stigma, etc., exactly what brown women face on a daily basis in terms of fair and lovely, etc. These are things that these individuals don't face on a daily basis. But second, it's I think also the fact that these are individuals who are much more aligned with their Western governments to begin with. So they're more aligned with the objectives and values of what their governments and their structures and their political MPs, etc., want in their own countries. So probably not go for something that is going to be controversial in nature and supports things like Islamic feminism. So that's something the West in general and the more affluent politicians in the West actually are opposed to, because they don't actually want these things to begin with. I think it probably means that these individuals have less of an incentive to care about actually talking about Islamic feminists or having individuals who are much less palatable in nature. What O says is that, like, apparently conservative feminism, they will probably be rejecting it regardless. We're going to prove to you why that is so problematic, because it skews like the internal and the initial perception people have of feminism to begin with. First, in terms of the compromise for progress, I think what was missing in terms of top half is that right now, the alternative ways of funding that exist is on the fact that states actually provide a lot of support in terms of NGOs like BRAC are also existing, and the fact that these are individuals who actually have a lot of activists on the ground. So on the comparative, we still have like people from Bangladesh called Wasifa Nazreen, who's essentially advocating for a lot of involvement in terms of like women in particular, and women who are more culturally aligned with our perception than values. I think this type of campaigning is much less antagonistic in nature for a few reasons. One is that it is less often like these institutions, like the value perception that you have of the movement in general is less going to be skewed to begin with. So what OG says is that it's good because of post-colonial feminism. I think it's also just because of the fact that individuals just think that these are issues that they can't relate to on a daily basis. So for example, their best case is probably individuals like Malala, but we've often seen that the views of motherhood in particular is something that is hostile and a lot of women in the developing world like Pakistan actually don't believe in. What this does is that it firstly impacts future brands of feminism within these countries, and it hurts the long-run sustainability that these value systems rely on. Right now, you need to break down campaigning. What exactly does this look like? Because I think OG misses out exactly on the counterfactual. One is that it looks like a lot of local organizations that already have existing connections going out and like expanding bases. Like for example, they're talking to poor villagers, they're framing content and our economic opportunities. What the West comes in is that they frame a lot of things about giving girls access to education as like bodily autonomy, but this is something that the local people on the ground who have less education, who are not Western centric, who are not have Western circles, are essentially going to align with, are not essentially going to believe you in. What O says is that you can still have a lot of media airtime that is still beneficial in terms of scale. One, most people in Bangladesh don't actually watch BBC on a daily basis. They watch local channels like Shamwai TV, etc., because these are things that are much more proximate to them. I think this means that you have to value the fact that these local heroes and role models, because they're just by proximate to these individuals, there's greater long-run sustainability, and you have more adaptations of value systems changing to begin with. I think on their comparative, they deprioritize issues pertaining to what women of color on a daily basis face in terms of like the stigma of like having like fair skin tone, etc. A lot of these things are things that often get ignored. But I think secondly is that a lot of Western feminism is often tied towards values such as independence and individualism. These are values that are not culturally ingrained within us, which means that a lot of it comes with the compromise of promoting values of like Asian values or like values the household women in particular promote and like subscribe to. I think it comes at a cost, and this campaigning is much more detrimental. Before that, I'll take up the away from all.
Why do the feminist movement's priorities informed by what white women are telling them rather than the trauma that they themselves experience on a day-to-day basis?
I think one, it's just the fact that most of the like when white women come in and like firstly like showcase and talk about these things, I think the initial perception is that this is a white person talking about your experiences that they necessarily can't relate to. But secondly is that I think it's still better on the counterfactual when we have local heroes and people that actually have like risen from like grassroots activism coming in and talking about issues such as like how exactly cultural values, how it's like okay for them to adopt things like cupcake feminism, etc. I think these are individuals who are going to be perceived less as an international puppet, but I think it's also the fact that these Western like white women in particular, like we've shown to you, why exactly they have less of an incentive to care about like what developing nations actually want, because they have their own political interests to like get more positions within their own government position in their own parliament, etc. I think on the comparative, we have local icons like Begum Roke, etc. at the cost of their comparative Judith Butler. I think these are individuals that local individuals actually know about, but it's also the buy-in that you get from like a lot of conservative men who are very prominent to begin with. Right now, Western feminism in particular seems a lot too extreme. A lot of women who actually subscribe to being like the identity of being a housewife don't actually subscribe to these values to begin with. You have like less of a better starting point for feminism on the ground, but you also remove the long-term sustainability for these developing countries. I think it means that we proved to you the tipping point. We also showed you why there's a lot of backlash and the compromise of funding in the future, which is that any of like openings like effectiveness arguments actually don't apply. On this one, I'm very proud to close.
Thanks. Thanks, member of government, for the fine speech. Member of opposition, you now have the floor. You can start when you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are indeed, loud and clear.
Yep, just give me 10 seconds.
Sure, no worries.
Yep, I'm just setting up my timer. Is there any background noise that's...
Nope.
Okay,
All right.
cool. Let's... Yep, okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel on site government, they've continuously talked about how like the Western movement is like characterized by white individuals, and they hold a large part of the discourse that occurs in society. But what they don't interact with is that if like these feminist movements in developing nations do not interact and do not have some sort of power parity in these Western feminist movements, that the Western feminist movements, isolated and having so much power, will erase all of the progress that these like in the best case these developing nation feminist movements have ever made, right? What they don't interact with on their side of the house is how whitewashing is going to be far more on their side if they have no accountability to be able to solve the problems that they take on themselves, right? So what I'm going to talk about in my speech is twofold, right? First, in terms of how and why accountability is established and important, and secondly, how the counterfactual will lead to the erasure of the progress of the feminist movements in these developing countries, right? First, but before that, a few rebuttals, right? First, in terms of what OG has said in terms of priorities, right? We do not think that Western feminist movements, when they come and interact with these feminist movements in developing nations, are going to keep the priorities that they have in their Western nations, right? We think it's unlikely for that to happen. Why is this? First, in terms of a self-correcting mechanism, I'll explain more of this later, but the self-correcting mechanism is minority women within the Western feminist movement who are going to hold the Western feminist movement accountable if they don't cater to the needs of these like developing nation feminist movements, right? But secondly, in terms of how the movement interaction happens, the movement interaction happens with these feminist movement in these developing nations, in that the feminists, like at the point at which you start interacting with these feminist movements in developing nations, you are going to have a lot of media attention in terms of being like, just because you're the more powerful one, you're going out and you're like empathizing with different feminist movements, you're going to get a lot of media attention. And at the point at which that feminist movement, the one in the developing nation, is able to get that kind of media attention, it has that much power to call these movements out at the point at which they don't give them the support that they need, and they prioritize different things rather than focusing on local issues. Lastly, on terms of information asymmetry, first, we don't think that movements are dumb enough to actually not care about the problems on the ground. Secondly, we think that they actually will try to gain more and more information from local leaders, because it's going to be cooperative, and these white movements aren't going to be isolated, and white women aren't going to come and protest over there, but they're just going to provide aid in terms of money and be able to like come on the ground and help them like gain more power parity in front of the government. But thirdly, we think that they're going to like co-opt into the narratives of the developing nations, simply because we think that it's more and more likely that they'll be effective, and their whole point is to be effective for these minority individuals, right? At the point at which they can't do that, they aren't standing with their principles, they're going to be called out by Western media. Lastly, in terms of the buy-in argument that they've given, right? First, they go on and say that they go on and say that, look, people won't buy into the feminist movement because it's Western, but they also go on to say that like these movements will somehow by themselves be able to create a lot of feminist change, right? But we don't think that's possible, because within the context of what they're doing, like the feminist principles that these feminist movements in developing nations are sticking to are ones that are idealistically Western, right? So at the point of which like we're having this clash in this debate, we think that the only way which you can solve it is by giving these feminist movements in developing nations more power in the Western feminist movements, and hence more credibility. But what are we going to talk to you about exclusively from CEO, right? First, in terms of how and why accountability is established and why it's important, right? First, we think that accountability is established on our side of the house, and we think that this is characteristic framing, because OO is not able to solve the problems of how Western nations will not dominate like the movements given the power parity, right? But we're going to tell you that first, accountability is established at the point at which you say that you are involved. How does this occur? We think that a lot of the benefits that come with being a Western feminist movement is the kind of news, like the Western media that you that like is all around you and is able to like throw your concerns out and like help you with legislation and stuff like that, right? At the point at which you start co-opting and like you start saying that you're going to help these feminist movements in other nations, you are going to be called out at the point of which you don't do that and you don't prioritize what they're saying, right? So at the point of which like you go on to these nations and in the worst case you say that, look, we're going to focus on like having trans-specific bathrooms instead of saying that we're going to help with like the major like gender like the women genocide that is occurring in those nations. We think you're going to get called out for not being effective. One, we think that this is counterintuitive in terms of how this feminist movement wants to work, hence their priority is to benefit them. But secondly, we think that this accountability is able to give more and more power to these like feminist movements in developing nations, simply because they get more and more power, get more and more media attention to be able to have some sort of credibility in the global platform. We don't think in the local platform on either side you are able to establish any sort of credibility, because you in and of yourself by government's characterization are seen as Western. But at the point of which you have the help of those Western movements and those Western movements that are seen as so powerful and so like world changing come and help you with your narrative and say that your narrative is actually good, we think that you get a lot of credibility to be able to bring about legislative change. No, I won't be taking the POI. Secondly, we think that in the counterfactual, we think that the counterfactual on their side of the house is how the feminist like movement is going on today, in that white people will dominate exactly like all of the discourse that is occurring. So the erasure will happen at the point of which you don't interact and you aren't able to hold these like Western feminist movements accountable. All of the narratives that are going to go out into the world, even in your nation, and to the conservatives that are going to skew the narrative, is that women are getting progress, right? So at the point of which, in your best case where you're able to get some progress, conservatives in your own country or the government leaders in and of themselves are going to say that, look, your feminist movement and the feminist movement that represents everyone in the world and has the most power is actually saying that you're getting progress and we don't think we need to help you. But at the point of which you have accountability, you can remove that erasure and say and have a lot of power in terms of the news media narratives that you can hold. But secondly, we think you're worse off because you don't have the ability to get support from these movements and you lose a lot of credibility in and of itself. We think that it's problematic when that occurs. Lastly, we think that the minority self-correction is something that can maintain the accountability, because these Western feminist movements are incredibly like vulnerable to minority individuals coming and calling them out for not standing for the only thing that they stand for, which is women equality. At that point, we think we've provided a clear analysis by which we take down all of government's arguments, but also provide you a very effective mechanism by which these feminist movements are able to go further. Very, very proud to oppose.
Thanks to a member of opposition for that fine speech. Government Whip, you now have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Hi, just making sure that I'm audible.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Just give me 1 second.
No worries.
Great. Hi, can you see me?
Yep, clear.
Okay, great. Great. I'm just going to start my timer. Before that, since this is being live streamed and all, this speech is for my teammate. Our team is going to end in like 2.5 weeks. So Aliya, thank you for tolerating me for the past however long. Great. Starting my speech in, POIs on chat, I'll take one from OO. And you can also wave at me, actually, I don't mind, but I'll, yeah, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 4 things in my speech. First, conservatives and whether or not they actually hate women. Second, accountability. The first 2 things directly going to engage to CO. Thirdly, solidarity. And fourthly, dangerous allyship. The last 2 things are going to engage to OO, weighing with OG within my speech. First, let's talk about conservatism. and like how we actually get change. And this is crucial because I think OG has a lot of stellar impacts, but I think Aliya is the only one that actually mechanizes a lot of those impacts by showing you how those grassroots movements actually occur. So let's answer the question about whether or not conservatives actually hate women. I think OO brings it up is that you are going to hate women regardless. And I think CO is someone like is a team that expands on it with regards to how you're not going to get buy-in. Here's the crucial framing, right? We don't necessarily think that conservatives hate women. Conservatives just hate radical change. That means as long as your feminism is always going to be attached to the West, it is always going to be seen as something that is radical. And that is specifically something that conservatives hate. If conservatives hated women, there would be no such thing as obligatory like primary schools shaped for women in a lot of South Asian developing countries. If they hated women, there would be no such thing as grassroots NGOs actually working towards alleviating a lot of suffering for women. We have NGOs that also provide things like free pads to a lot of women in rural areas in Bangladesh as well. The only change that has happened is specifically because in a lot of South Asian countries, conservatives are not necessarily opposed to women empowerment. They're opposed to the frame through which that empowerment happens. That is why if you want any sort of empowerment, it is important to frame it in a crucial way. Mechanisms then, a couple of things here. First, we have slow structural change that is not necessarily idealistically Western compared to what CO says. Why? Because of a couple of things. One, NGOs probably still exist under our world and they're able to do things like grassroots movement. That is worse under your world because the question and the critique is always going to be, who is the leader of your NGO? Where is all of this money coming from, etc. Insofar as you are never able to answer these questions because your funding is something that's tied to like the West and Western alliances, etc., you are always going to be shut down. Under our world, if it starts grassroots and you can point to local role models who actually understand the plight of these women, we think that you're able to answer those questions better and be more palatable framing that Aliya gives you. Second, we think that a lot of these grassroots movements then, most women in a lot of rural areas don't know what feminism is. And their only exposure then comes from white women who talk about how motherhood is incredibly regressive. And a lot of these women actually don't agree with it. That is why under your world, your perception of feminism is always going to be Emma Watson talking about how housewives, etc., is something that is regressive and like an agent of the patriarchy, whereas a lot of women in Bangladesh find a lot of utility from things like motherhood, and that is incredibly a valid choice to make. But under our world then, assuming that this is a grassroots movement that start from local individuals and local NGOs, etc., you can frame your empowerment around things like, yes, being mothers is an incredibly legitimate choice, but here is why birth control is probably good for your own health, etc. We think that that is a lot better under our world. Fourthly, your framing is always going to be first world if you are tied to the West. I know that Western feminists are not stupid, but I also think that they're culturally insensitive. That is because they always think that their white savior complex is the correct brand of feminism that should exist in these developing countries. We just disagree. That is why under our world, a lot of your framing of the environment is going to be either pragmatic, that is going to tap into these like conservative areas and show you can have economic benefits if you send your daughter to high school rather than get her married, etc. I think we can actually get a lot of change. Fourthly, this change also manifests. I'm going to take OO at 5th minute, so like a little later. Cool. So I think then this change also manifests through political changes, etc. Because assuming that conservatives already sort of don't really hate women, I think the way in which you change their mind is appealing to biases that they already have. Insofar as they want economic benefits for their own community, if you can frame the fact that sending more girls to school is going to give them that economic benefit, I think they're much more likely to listen to you, assuming you can back up their questions of who are you funded with and who's your leader, etc., assuming these are all local role models that you draw your inspiration from. But this also translates to things like political change. You can elect things like local women MPs in your municipal elections, etc., and have a lot of political change happen more under our world when the framing of these grassroots movement is something that is entirely local in nature. We think that that is a change that we bring under our world. Secondly, on accountability, the first thing to say here is that if this accountability comes at the cost of vulnerable women, we literally don't want that. But secondly, assuming that accountability was something that was a lot more different, very, very important. Here's how I don't think CO can actually get that accountability either. Because one, no Western feminist movement would care about no Western feminist movement would change their narrative and suddenly shift it to, oh yes, motherhood is actually a great tool for empowerment in developing countries, because they want to be more palatable to the governments in their own countries. So their narrative of feminism is always going to be something that favors them at the cost of women in developing countries. That is why accountability doesn't really happen under your world. But secondly, accountability, assuming that it was important, is something that movement is very internal. It happens throughout decades over time when people realize that white feminism is not that intersectional. We don't think that you need to accept aid from Western feminism and then suddenly hold those feminists accountable, especially given if you don't have a lot of media capture and power and finances to begin with to hold them accountable. We think they can hold themselves accountable. That happens internally. Presumably you want to be more intersectional as a movement. We think we can claim that under our world. Before moving on, I'll take OO.
Your extreme impacts are hung on an unrealistic characterization of white women going to inaccessible rural villages and talking about turfs and paternity leave. Realistically, our ability to spread applicable movements to the developing world, like Me Too, combat problems like human trafficking, and vastly strengthen movements like giving them money outweigh.
The problem is we can get a lot of those movements because a lot of grassroots NGOs already exist under our world, and given because of your own characterization that there's more things like educations, etc., that is happening, more women, especially more middle-class women in these countries, presumably want to change things for rural women in their own countries. The problem is if you accept aid from a Western nation and a Western alliance of something that conservatives already hate, you make that change regressive. That is the change. Solidarity then. Race, class struggles, conservatism, liberalism, pro-life versus pro-choice. There's literally no solidarity. And that is fine, right? Because the illusion of solidarity is the problem. Because when Nicki Minaj calls out Taylor Swift and white capture of Grammys, and Taylor Swift says, look, you're supposed to be solidarity like towards women, etc., that is inherently bad because it undermines the nuances of like racial differences. We think having splintering is justified insofar as that splintering gives different women of different sects the ability to make changes for things that they exclusively need, even if it is the cost of some illusion of solidarity that already doesn't exist. We are fine with that. But secondly, it is untrue that like immigrants, etc., have large sizable populations to actually change things under OO's world either. Presumably because they're always going to be a minority in Western nations, etc. That means that their ability to enact things like political capital, given high amounts of things like anti-immigration sentiments, etc., that may exist in developed countries anyway, is also largely limited. That political capital doesn't exist. Lastly, we think dangerous allyship is incredibly problematic. You can be a privileged Bangladeshi woman growing up in Canada talking about how Bangladesh is regressive for women, etc. The problem is a lot of those like comments, etc., is going to be faced by a lot of like vulnerable women that live in those specific countries that you're talking about putting on blast on media. This is dangerous allyship. We think that is problematic. It exclusively hurts women in developing countries. Extremely proud to be on the right side of this debate. Thank you.
Thanks to Government Whip for the fine speech. Opposition Whip, you now have the floor. You can start whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'll just take 10 seconds.
Oh, sure.
Hi, can someone confirm if I'm audible?
You are indeed.
Okay, perfect. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think what both government benches miss the most is the framing around what the world looks like and what accountability in this world looks like. We think that is what Neel gives to you in his speech. And we think that is what is important to understanding this debate in the first place and then winning this debate. We think the world just generally lacks nuance, right? Which means not everyone in the world is going to realize that like the developing movements have isolated themselves or shifted away from like developed movements inherently, right? We think at that point of time, what this means is that the Western movement continues to be the face of global feminism and continues to lead the narratives around global feminism inherently. We think the point at which the West goes out and says that like we have moved on from the third wave of feminism to the fourth, we think it assumes progress on overall feminism, right? Which means it never really encapsulates the difference between like the developing movement's progress and the Western movement's progress, because the developing movement has refused to become a part of this overall global feminist movement or like this overall global feminist revolution. We think the point at which that happens, the progress that these developing movements have made get erased, and you have no accountability metrics to go ahead and call out the global Western feminist movement because you've refused to be involved with them in the first place. We think that is the kind of framing under which accountability becomes so important, because the point at which the Western movement goes out and says that, oh, we are now going to fight for equal pay, all your progress in terms of fighting for basic sanitation is now nullified, and people can tell you like, oh, aren't you fighting for equal pay now, right? I think the difference on our side of the world, the point at which you're involved with Western feminism in the first place, is that you can call out the Western movement when they say that, oh, we are going to fight for equal pay because we have finished the third and fourth wave, right? We think the difference now is you can hold them accountable because you are a stakeholder of global feminism who actively participates in like conversation surrounding global feminism in the first place. This is why Neel's characterization around this was so important, because we think irrespective of what either side debates, Western feminism continues to be the face of global feminism. Like pop culture narrative surrounding feminism is still driven by Western feminism. Then it becomes your decision if you want to be part of this outreach program, if you want to enjoy the aid and benefits of Western feminism, and if you want to call them out when they don't talk about your problems when they're giving like a UN speech, right? I think the ability to call them out specifically exists on closing opposition because you are now a stakeholder of Western feminism. Quick responses to OG and CG before I move on to like show you why we take it over OO, right? First off, I think OG shoots themselves in the foot where they go ahead and say that like, oh, we will allow donations, but we won't allow things like strategy and logistics, because inherently their argumentation surrounds this framing that people hate the West, which means if you continue to accept donations from the West, you will still get the same amount of hatred. But secondly, right, their entire case is surrounding this idea that people hate the West. Hence, if you buy into something that the West is doing, people will hate you too. We think that the far right is still going to hate you either way because they think that feminism is an inherently Western concept in and of itself, right? We don't think that conservatives hate women, but we think conservatives hate the word feminism because they associate it to everything that is Western in and of itself, which means they will still impede your progress on either side of the world, whether or not you're related to like the Western movement in and of itself, which means like you would rather enjoy the kind of aid, resources, and strategy which you can gain from the West, the kind of outreach you can gain from the West, because conservatives on either side of the world will give you shit for it. But secondly, right, and like this is an argument which is sort of equal on both CG and OG, because CG's entire case is sort of a glorified argument about whitewashing within the global feminist movement in and of itself. It's something that OG already argues. We tell you right from Neel's speech that whitewashing is actually much worse on their side of the house, because now the Western movements can just get away by not talking about your problems when they represent when they represent global feminism on like platforms such as like United Nations or like extremely important media channels in the first place. We think the difference then is that they can erase your progress the point at which you aren't involved with them, because you have no mechanism to go ahead and hold them accountable and ask them, oh, why didn't you talk about our problems? You have no mechanism to go out and call out Western feminism for being an unrepresentative face of global feminism. You can tell them that, look, this is against the principles of feminism. We have always fought for equality or like representation and inclusion, but the point at which you don't talk about our problems, you're violating all these principles, right? All of these avenues of call out, all of these avenues of representation exist exclusively on closing opposition in and of itself. But secondly, right, if this idea then is going to be about this alternative, which is indigenous grassroots movements, we think that opening government has somehow replaced analysis and like mechanism with examples, right? We don't think naming a few grassroots movements is enough analysis for like why and how grassroots movements work in the first place. We think clearly like CG did a better job. We're going to deal with that in the later stage of my speech. But secondly, right, what does CG then talk about, and why do we think they too fall out of this debate with regards to us? First, we think like it's not just the idea that their extension is very, very similar to what like OG has already said, or that it's just like a glorified whitewashing argument in the first place. But second, right, we tell you that if then the argument from their side that comes out is going to be that like feminism in developing nations are going to like just fall for what white feminists are asking them to do, we don't understand why that's the case, right? First off, we've already told you why call-out mechanisms exist, which means that like developing feminist movements can call out white feminism for not talking about their problems. We see this regularly when like black feminism in the United States calls out like white leaders of feminism for not representing their problems in the first place, when they call them out for like not talking about things like sanitation and like stepping out of gender roles in and of itself, right? But secondly, right, the reason that these callouts will be taken seriously is because feminism sells on inclusion. Feminism sells on being able to represent yourself, and the point at which they stray away from their principle, they've lost the kind of purity they've always stood for. We don't think feminists will do that. Before I move on, POI from OG.
Your extension assumes that the developing world feminists will be able to take on white feminists with generations of education and financial privilege and beat them at their own game. That's probably why O didn't make this argument, by the way. It's pretty hard to make.
I'm not sure if you were listening, but I never said they will either beat them at their own game or become the most powerful force of feminism. I just said that they can hold the global feminism movement accountable to make them listen to your problems in the first place in and of itself, right? Because we don't think that feminists or like white feminists are going to try to cut you out in any way, right? We think they too have incentives to listen to you, because to continue being the face of global feminism, they have to go out there and justify why they are the face of global feminism, right? The point at which they're getting criticized regularly by like developing nations for not being representative enough, we don't think that like Western feminism can hold on to the kind of power they have, which means they have incentives to go out and listen to you in the first place. You should have listened to Neel's speech. Lastly, what's our difference from opening opposition and like why do we take it over them? We think opening opposition's large chunk of argument is contingent on saying that like resources and like, aid from the West are good. We agree, right? But we don't think they ever like talk about this idea of accountability at all, which is the key factor that differentiates opposition bench from government bench in the first place. But we don't even think they mechanize things like outreach or like how pop culture and like the global feminist movement plays into this in and of itself. We think they've easily taken this debate. Extremely proud to oppose.
Thanks to Opposition Whip for that fine speech. With that, it concludes this debate. Thanks everyone for a wonderful debate. I think I and my panels, we will go on for a deliberation. I think we can close the recording for now. I'd like Jimmy as well. So I think could the outcome tell us whether it would be helpful for us to discuss deliberation to get on Zoom, or would you rather we have it on Discord? Like, is there any preference from outcome? If not, we can all hop back on Discord and discuss.
It's preferable if you can discuss in Discord and then you can announce the results here later.
All right, sure. That sounds amazing. So
I mean, about the announcement, we haven't decided anything yet, but you can use Discord for discussing the results.
All right, sure. So we will hop back on Discord. Let's go everyone, and we can, I think, discuss on room 1 result discussion. As for the teams, please give them instructions on what they should do, because I think it would be unfair to not keep them confused. So yeah, that. All right, thank you everyone.
Also, whoever is streaming, could you please stop the stream?
Thanks everyone.
Yep. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.